I specifically said, look, everybody has a right to express their, individual personhood, but what you don't have the right is to ask me to celebrate and coddle your personhood.
I think eventually there is a path there where you come around to understand that it's not because Christianity recommends, X, Y, and Z, but it's through Christianity that we become great.
And of course, this upends the whole purpose of becoming parents, which is that the world stops and is no longer about you. I mean, that's why you grow up and you have kids and you have responsibilities. And
they passed the anti-alt-right resolution, which is basically to say they condemn racism, but they only condemn whites who happen to be racist. And of course, by their definition, all whites are racist unless they have a sufficient amount of self-hatred.
Today, white people are constantly being told that race is a social construct. It's not even biological. It's some sort of sociological optical illusion.
You get someone who's just a global citizen, and they might well be mixed race, which is part of it, that adds to it. And you think, where do you belong? Yeah, you belong in a shopping mall. There's nothing to you other than that.
Hello, 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 everybody. I am your host, Matthew Drake, and welcome to World of Scarcity, Episode 2. I would, as usual, like to start with a moment of prayer, so please bow your heads. Dear Heavenly Father, care of our patron spirit, Charles the Hammer Martel, we thank Thee for this stream and this opportunity. We also are grateful for the gift of winter and the remembrance that winter is not only coming, winter is here. Please help us. Please steel our resolve as we face the challenges ahead. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, I would also, while we're waiting for people to come in, let me give a scripture reading as well, so that you can have a very holy day today. And I picked this reading because, well, after Thanksgiving, this is the time when a lot of people are saying, you, white man, you committed these atrocities long ago, and remember all the times that you gave smallpox blankets to the Indians. Well, this is karma. What's happening to you now? Terrible, terrible things. And so I just want to read what the Bible has to say about this. This is Ezekiel 18:5 through 20. If a man is righteous and does what is lawful and right, if he does not eat upon the mountains or lift up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, does not defile his neighbor's wife or approach a woman in her time of impurity, does not oppress anyone, but restores to debtor his pledge, commits no robbery, gives his bread to the hungry, and covers the naked with a garment, does not lend at interest or take any increase, withholds his hand from iniquity, executes true justice between man and man, walks in my statutes, and is careful to observe my ordinances. He is righteous. He shall surely live, says the Lord God. If he begets a son who is a robber, a shedder of blood, who does none of these duties, but eats upon the mountains, defiles his neighbor's wife, oppresses the poor and needy, commits robbery, does not restore the pledge, lifts up his eyes to the idols, commits abomination, lends at interest, and takes increase, shall he then live? He shall not live. He has done all these abominable things. He shall surely die. His blood shall be upon himself. But if this man begets a son, who sees all the sins which his father has done, and fears, and does not do likewise, who does not eat upon the mountain, or lift up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, does not defile his neighbor's wife, does not wrong anyone, exacts no pledge, commits no robbery, but gives his bread to the hungry, and covers the naked with a garment, withholds his hand from iniquity, takes no interest or increase, observes my ordinances, and walks in my statutes, he shall not die for his father's iniquity. He shall surely live as for his father, because he practiced extortion, robbed his brother, and did what is not good among his people. Behold, he shall die for his iniquity. Yet you say, why should not the son suffer for the iniquity of the father? When the son has done what is lawful and right, and has been careful to observe all my statutes, he shall surely live. The soul that sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So thank you to those of you in the chat who are joining us. Yes, we will be talking about Stefan Molyneux's critique of Tucker Carlson in his interview with Ben Shapiro. First, though, I wanted to thank people who have given me feedback, constructive criticisms of the past 2 streams that I've done. I've taken what you've said and incorporated it and tried to make the show a little better. But I will say, I think I've been too nice to all of you, because in the past stream, the first stream especially, I was reading a lot of the chat, and, well, frankly, I'm going to be doing less of that. And if you want to get some kind of interaction with me, I encourage you to donate super chats, and I will make sure those get read. But it's not fair if I'm just on here having a conversation with you. It's not fair to the people who come and watch it later. So just be aware. I will be reading the chat. I will look and see what you're saying, but just be aware. I might not always be able to respond unless you give me money. And so, without further ado, let's get into the video of Stefan Molyneux, which is called The Horrible, Terrible, No Good Carlson-Shapiro Debate. Here we go.
As a public intellectual is to not disappoint you, while at the same time the challenge that I have undertaken as a public intellectual is to not disappoint you, while at the same time remaining in close adherence to the truth and reason and evidence. And it's a tough act, it's a tough balance. I embrace it with enthusiasm and appreciate all of your support. Thus,
well, I'm glad Steph mentioned this, because I just want to take a moment to emphasize here that this is coming from a place of love when I criticize someone who I consider to be one of the greats of all time, and he has truly contributed so much to philosophy and the modern intellectual discourse, and I owe a lot to him, not just in my intellectual journey, but also in my personal journey. He's had a huge influence, so no hard feelings. And I think every true philosopher will understand that if you really want to show respect, what you do is you speak up when you have disagreements, and you try to show that person where they have gone astray.
I hope you can understand why, to me, it was a little shocking and somewhat disappointing to see the debate between Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro that aired recently. So I'm just going to zoom in on one particular part about driverless trucks, which I think has within it embedded.
And I wanted to stop there because he does say, I wanted to zoom in on a particular part. And I actually missed this the first time I was watching it. And when I watched this video first, just so you know, and then I went and watched the interview of Shapiro on Tucker's. You know, it wasn't set up to be a debate, but they knew going in that they were going to have some contention around economic issues. And I watched that debate, which was about 50 minutes. And I was shocked because it's like, wow, I thought this whole thing was going to be about driverless cars, which is primarily what, as you'll see, Stefan is talking about here. So that's just one thing. That's one important thing to note. I wish, just watching this, that Steph had given us a wider context, because if you watch that original video, what you saw was the way that they got to the driverless cars question is that Tucker was talking about marriage and the family and the falling wages of men across America, which you may have seen my illustrated video on this topic. If not, just search falling wages, Tucker Carlson, and I illustrated that. But he makes a good point, which is this: marriage rates are plummeting. And why is that? People are still having kids, but they're having kids out of wedlock. And one of the big factors for falling marriage rates is that women are now making about as much as men. And for most women, if you ask the average woman, do you want to marry someone who is making less money than you? Most women will say, well, no, I don't really, even though they admit that they don't necessarily value money as a whole, still they have an aversion to this. And so that was Tucker's point, is that this phenomenon where men are not making as much as, well, they're still making more on average, and you can go into the debunking of the wage gap and everything. That's all valid. But the fact is, more and more women are entering the workplace, and this has had a huge effect on the economy. And so Tucker, the context of this question was really of would you ban driverless cars? It was around marriage and the family, and I think that's unfortunate that context got left out here. Let's continue.
Added a huge amount of information and arguments and morality regarding freedom and independence. So Tucker Carlson, who I generally like, did discharge a B-52's worth of emotional bombast on Ben Shapiro, and it is tough when you are faced with somebody who is absolutely kneeling at the feet of their own populist emotional rhetoric to counter it, because it looks kind of mean. And basically the argument went something like this. So,
wait a second. It looks kind of mean. Is that what he said? It looks kind of mean? Isn't that more kind of isn't that itself emotional language? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I understand why some people would say I don't want to be a populist. And the interesting thing is Tucker says he's not a populist. If you listen to his conversations, his debates, he's not a populist. And he says the reason is because populism shouldn't be necessary. Populism is only necessary when the elites who are in charge of the society are corrupt and do not have the interests of the people at heart. And that's clearly the case today. And so Donald Trump was a reaction to this. So a lot of people are rallying, or not just in America, but in Europe, with Salvini and Orban. A lot of people are rallying around populist people, but populist doesn't necessarily mean left or right. No, populist is just a revolt, if you will, of the normal order of things.
Ben Shapiro asked Tucker Carlson if he, Tucker, would ban, if he was the president, would ban driverless trucks, or if he was in charge of that agency of the government, would he ban driverless trucks? Now, that's a complex question for sure, and there's lots of nuance in it, none of which was addressed by Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson basically jimmied up his sophistry and said, "Are you kidding? Absolutely, I would ban driverless trucks, because driving for a living is the single most common job for high school educated men in all 50 states, and this, he said, is the same group whose wages have declined by 11% over the past 30 years. Family will be
Yeah, let's be honest, though. We are talking about mostly white people, right? And I have to say that I understand why Stefan does not point out the fact, he does not point out the ethnicity of these two individuals in the room. I understand why he does not do that, because people would immediately say, oh, you're jumping to conclusions, and oh, just because, well, you want to frame everything in terms of race. But at the same time, can we really neglect that fact? I think we can say our ideal is to look at individuals as an individual and to look at the arguments at just in terms of the arguments. But that's not where we are, right? You're not watching a video of two anonymous people debating. You're watching Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro. And people are aware of that. People are aware of the fact that Ben Shapiro is Jewish, both ethnically and religiously, and Tucker is a white Protestant. So I think we have to comment on this fact. No, certainly you don't have to, and it's fine that Stefan does not comment on that. But I think it's given where we are in the world, it is disappointing to see that it doesn't come up anywhere. You know, he could at least say, I acknowledge that this is the case, but here's why it does not fit into these stereotypes of two people arguing like a host and a parasite of culture. So let us continue.
Destroyed, it will be horror show, and we're going to end up as pure communism if we don't ban driverless trucks. Now, there was a lot of like, well, the greater good is protecting your citizens, and I just want a country where people can have safe and happy and prosperous lives. And it's like calling yourself an expert doctor or surgeon because you say, I just want people to be healthy. Saying it is a whole lot different from being able to achieve it. And he did also pull the rhetorical device of saying, well, the free market, I love capitalism, but it shouldn't be a religion where we sacrifice everyone on the altar of abstract ideals like free trade and so on. And
well, I mean, it's a fair question. I mean, what? Okay, it's a rhetorical point, but does that mean that Stefan thinks that capitalism should be a religion? If capitalism in the moment leads to a scenario down the road in which capitalism is hindered, then what do you do? Like, at some point, even if you say capitalism is good, that leaves out the aspect of time, right? Because we're not in some kind of abstract box here. We're in the real world, and Steph says, you know, he is talking about practicalities and how to achieve things, right, in the real world. And so how do we achieve that? How do we achieve capitalism, which, at least in the United States, and I think the West in general, has been in decline. We're heading more towards socialism, and Steph knows very well, because of the presentation he's done on immigration, that is due to the importation of foreign cultures and foreign peoples, largely, non-white peoples. And I'm not saying, of course, that white people always equals capitalism. I think you do have this interesting divide between Europe, which has tended to go more socialist, and America, or which broke off from England and so on. You do have different strains of it showing up, so we're not some big homogeneous blob, of course, but just in general, we can say that whites vote Republican and non-whites do not. So, this is a question. What do we want to value? Do we want to value pushing ideology in the moment, i.e., free markets, capitalism, making sure that in the moment we have as much of that as possible, while we've got these open borders, mind you. We've got still open borders, not open borders, but we've got still porous borders. We don't have a wall. And the UN Migration Pact is going forward, it seems. Places like Canada are going to be flooded with immigrants. This is a huge problem. How can you say that we can even talk about anything else before we solve this problem is just mind-boggling to me. But here we are doing it. And again, I came from libertarianism. I want to be for capitalism, free markets. I think that is the best way, ultimately, that we achieve our goals and we prosper. But we have to look at the realities of the political system and the demographics. Let's go on.
Tucker did say, well, this is why half of young people or more like socialism, because they can't get ahead, they can't dig themselves out from under student loans, they can't afford to buy houses, let alone cars, and so on. And so he said, this is why people like socialism, and we've got to fix it by banning new industries. And he also made the case, so communism, he said, happened, this is Tucker Carlson, communism happened because of a lack of management of the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. And that is it's patently false. Communism happened because a small dedicated group of revolutionaries seized power. Communism happened, at least in, you could argue around the world, but in general, communism happened in Russia because America entered the First World War.
Okay. So, the historical aspect of all this, to be fair, I'm not a historian, right? But I do know that when you're talking about revolutions and the revolutions in Europe, well, ethnicity, it's not an irrelevant factor here. And yes, I agree with Steph that there is a gun in the room. But the thing is, there's a bunch of people who want to use the gun against us. And I think the crux of this debate is really, are you going to let those people get a hold of the gun before you? I'm not too keen to let that happen because we've seen what can happen in history when we allow that to go forward. And so when your worldview is about ideology rather than race, or rather than when the lens that you see the world is primarily through ideology and race does not play into it, that's a very dangerous thing, because people who are against you racially don't care that much about ideology. They are trying to win the conflict that they are fighting on. And if there's anything that I've learned partly through watching stuff. It's that you must engage with people on the level that they're on. You have to fight the game that they are engaging in, and it's a shame that he isn't acknowledging that.
This is the horrible demonic dominoes you set in motion when you use violent government power in the pursuit of political or geopolitical ends. So the United States ended the First World War, and Germany, otherwise everybody would have fought to its standstill, and everybody would have gone back home, and hopefully the brutal lesson of Western European war in a post-industrial society would have been learned, and there would not have been a Second World War. But instead, America jumped in to the First World War, which caused Germany to panic, and knew that it needed to get Russia off its eastern borders, and therefore the German government funded a group of revolutionaries to foment a communist revolution in Russia. So, of course, Wilson entered into the war in order to make the world safe for democracy, and then sunk massive amounts of, well, basically the entire population of Russia.
Right. Wilson. So I got this comment in one of my on one of my videos, which was that nationalism caused World War I. Nationalism caused World War I, and that's kind of the standard narrative that we're fed about World War I, and it completely ignores the fact that, and then because of World War I, there was World War II, so on. So what it ignores is that there were nefarious elements within the nation, right? Is it really a nation if you've only got a supermajority? Like, let's say that there's, 5% Muslims in a society, right? Well, but it's 95% white, okay? Well, it's still basically a white nation, right? And we've all got this threshold of how we can tolerate things. But is it really fair to call that a nation when you are not homogenous and you've got these other groups in there who have not been integrated? It's one thing to integrate new people, especially within your own race, like happened in America where they brought Irish over and they assimilated. But to have these people who do not and often will not ever assimilate, I don't think that we've seen the proof of people assimilating to the fact where, to the point where they just ignore completely their heritage, right? Because that's what they want white people to do, is ignore their heritage. Well, if you are coming in and you want to be assimilated, then you have to really become white in every sense that you can. And I'm not saying that assimilation will work, but when you've got, back in the 20th century, when you've got a class of people who are not part of that homeland, even if it's a small percentage, they can impact the politics, and especially if that class of people is rich and has a lot of influence internationally, a lot of control over corporations. That's a consideration. And I think, everything from the Balfour Declaration to lots of these other red pills, which I'm not going to go into here, we can see that it's not a fair assessment to say that nationalism caused these world wars, because it's just not borne out by what the leaders themselves were saying leading up to the point where they went to war. For instance, even someone as terrible as Hitler, right? We know that he did not want to invade Europe, right? He wrote extensively about his admiration for the English, and this was not his aim, but he was pushed into it by these other allied powers and so on. And I think it's important to keep that in mind.
and then Eastern Europe after the Second World War, shortly thereafter China, and then of course Korea, North Korea, North Vietnam, and Cambodia, and Cuba, and you name it, all because originally America decided to enter into the First World War, because you don't know what happens when you unleash the dogs of war. So communism happened because of government intervention. Communism happened because the fascism of the draft was imposed upon American men. They were sent to Europe, and Germany then took Russia out of the war by fomenting revolution rather than fighting on the front. So the idea that, well, you see, it was just a lack of management of the transition from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy is just a shocking lack of knowledge of history. And
well, no, it's not necessarily agrarian versus industrial. It's but you see, there are things that are not polite to talk about, and race is one of those in society. And so frankly, I do believe, Tucker will say that he's not dog whistling, and maybe he's not doing it consciously. But I think when you're talking about urban versus rural and so on, there's something implicit in that, and that's just because, in general, a certain race tends to go more towards. So white people, for instance, tend to go more towards the rural lifestyle than a lot of other people, because that's where they feel comfortable, for one, and they also don't trust a lot of the people in the city. I used to live in the city, but I'm becoming less and less city dwelling, and I think a lot of people understand those sentiments just because of the transformation that's happened. So it's not something inherent about cities necessarily, but it is cities attracting a certain kind of people, and then that is a self-reinforcing cycle.
And of course, all societies had challenges moving from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. America and France and Holland and the United Kingdom and Canada, it was all tough. So why didn't they all go communist? Well, that doesn't really explain anything. But it is basically, it's a weird kind of abstract threat that people sometimes make when they're in debates. You see, if we allow for driverless trucks in America, we're going to end up grinding and being ground into human waste and paste under the boots, heels, and gun butts of a totalitarian communist dictatorship.
So that's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's fair. Exaggerations are perhaps allowed. I would say that this thing about emotional consequences, right? Appealing to emotions and appealing to consequentialism. What is going to happen if this chain of events takes place? And this is part of debates. This is part of not so much philosophy, but just arguing tactics and how to move forward, and also debates in general, is what is going to happen if we ban driverless cars or don't ban driverless cars. And so a lot of times this is called fear mongering, right? Oh, well, you're just fear mongering, which I don't know. It's one of these things that sometimes it is more accurate than other times, and it isn't a great philosophical tool. It is more of a rhetorical tool, because you can certainly use that against people, right? You're fear mongering. Oh, well, that's not good. You're trying to drive up fear. But what if it's fear towards something that people should actually be afraid of? Is that still fear mongering? No, I mean, generally what we think of is you have this irrational fear. And so a lot of the debating that happens under the surface is this fear actually rational or not? And I think, Stefan would say the driverless cars thing, it's not a rational fear. I think to give you sort of my whole opinion, if you will, I'm not really rooting for one side or the other, because I do come down somewhere in the middle, and we'll get into more of why. But this whole thing about emotional consequences. 10 minutes ago, Stefan was talking about what happens if you have socialism. What is going to happen? Well, you're going to have extreme poverty, and he says that that's borne out by history. And so, I would just say we need more evidence to understand why, if Stefan is right, that socialism's emotional consequences are bad and you should be afraid of that, but driverless cars' emotional consequences are they're mute. They're not actually tangible. And I think he could show that, but just saying that it's because of you're appealing to emotion is not a good enough answer.
So, do you want your driverless trucks, or do you want your basic freedoms? And of course, this is not a good argument. It's not an argument at all. And Tucker Carlson was reduced to mealy-mouthed, hallmark-card platitudes like, I just want decent people to live happy lives. Yeah, I don't even know. So he says...
probably another dog whistle. Decent people. Well, what do you think of when you think of decent people? Do you think of people in the city who are more prone to crime and more prone to violence and stuff like this? No, you're probably thinking basically of your average Trump supporter, the white person in middle America. I mean, let's be honest, they're still the majority, and so he's got these kind of ways of talking about the heartland of America, the the common man, the good person. It's like, yeah, you're just talking about the founding stock of the country that this country was founded on, the people that built a lot of the, or at least their ancestors built a lot of the infrastructure and so on, and the government that is what is attracting other people to come to this country. They want to come for the Gibbs.
That the driverless trucks would put 10 million men out of work. It would destroy families. It would be a horrible thing for society, and again would propel America towards a communist-style dictatorship. So that's kind of hysterical. It's not an argument, of course. The appeal to disastrous consequences is never an argument. It's like saying, well, you see, we can't end slavery because, you see, nobody will pick the food, nobody will pick the cotton, so we'll all starve to death. And surely even the slaves would starve to death, and surely the slaves would rather live than die, and surely the slaves would rather remain slaves than starve to death, and you can invent dire consequences for every...
So I just talked about this, actually. I won't spend too much time on it, but the slavery thing is interesting because I think what Tucker is trying to say is that a lot of people feel that they are economically enslaved because of the systems that have been set up, and because a lot of these systems are not in their interest. They're not in the interests of health. And see, I mean, I don't think that Stefan is a relativist when it comes to what is healthy and what is not healthy. But he would say, rightly, we should allow people to make those decisions for themselves, right? And the problem is there are people out there in the government and high up in corporations who I think do not want that choice to be available, or they want to at least incentivize the unhealthy decisions as much as possible, make those as easy as it is. And even if it means using government, they're not opposed to that. Use government and dump fluoride in the water or something, lower the testosterone of the population by putting out these bad foods and stuff, and subsidizing them with the government. So they certainly do. They're not ashamed to use government to get their ends, but more when they can't, they want to incentivize the the bad behaviors over the good behaviors. And it is a shame, and it's a moral failing. Largely, I think, this used to be a role that the church filled. It was reminding people that they must maintain their morality and not give into nihilism and pornography and so on. But those days are gone, and a lot of people are just out there by themselves. They're just individuals, and individuals are not very strong. Say what you will about individualism, everyone knows that a group is going to have more strength, more power in society, and that doesn't have to even be martial power. But so it really is, when you look at it, I think it's becoming harder to deny that this is a malicious effort to grind down the soul of people. And while I would like for them to have their autonomy, we need to do whatever we can, and if it means using government at some point to turn that around and make it so that healthy lifestyles are encouraged over unhealthy lifestyles, what is your argument against that?
Every proposition, and this race for disaster scenario panic mongering is not how civilized men and women resolve disputes about the use of force in society. You appeal to principle. Slavery is wrong. I don't care what happens after slavery. Slavery is wrong. And giving the government the massive power to throw people in jail who are trying to generate a new industry is wrong and immoral. It's like, well, you see, we don't want a giant authoritarian government controlling the economy. So the way we save ourselves from that is give the giant government the massive power to completely destroy a new industry. You see, we have to save capitalism by giving government power to control massive sectors of the economy through...
I missed a super chat here. Kit sends £2. Tucker did resort to emotion over logic. Yes, so Ben Shapiro, he's the facts don't care about your feelings guy. And, okay, he resorted to emotion. Well, the fact is, emotion is very powerful. I don't see why we can't use both. That's kind of what I'm trying to do here. I don't see why we can't have logic and say. Now, okay, to be fair with Tucker, I don't want to seem like I'm like he didn't do anything wrong, because I think his instinct to jump in there and say, are you kidding? Are you kidding? Of course I would ban driverless cars in a heartbeat. I think that was not a smart tactic, although you can argue it certainly got a lot more attention to this issue because that was kind of the viral moment. But I would not have engaged in that. I would have said, well, I think, and it's kind of surprising, right? Because earlier in his the interview, Tucker was saying, these issues are complex. We have to look at multiple sides of things. And then immediately he goes and says, well, of course I'd ban driverless cars. I would have liked to see more of a willingness to negotiate on that issue, because I think that even though, I might in the end come down on not banning driverless cars, I would really like to see some kind of negotiation, right? The people who are the Ben Shapiros of the world who want this, it's like, well, what are we going to get? The people who, let's say they don't care about your principles, they're just interested in kind of themselves and their own whatever you have there. What are they going to get in exchange for that? Like, you're offering them nothing, Ben Shapiro. Why, like, do you not understand that these people are human and they have, like, can you not empathize with the situation that they're in at least? And I think he would say, oh yeah, of course I empathize. But, you know, facts and logic and this is what we should do. But, you know, politics are a negotiation. And so that is largely what I like about Trump is sometimes he'll come out and have these stances which are a little more, well, they're frankly just out of this world when it comes to the GOP politics in general, right? Trump, for instance, Medicaid for all or something like that, you know, he'll make sort of gestures towards that, but then reel it back in later, and it gets people sort of thinking, oh, maybe he's on this side or he's sympathetic towards these things, and then later on he can say, well, we can't go all the way because there's this other side of things, and that, you know, but because I empathize with this, maybe we can go part of the way and you can give something else. And so I think that for people who are intellectuals and they're talking about this, they're not thinking about the actual decisions that politicians are going to make. And you can say whatever you will about government and the immorality of government, and sure, that's all valid. But that's how things get done in the real world. And if you want to be more of a politician on these things, it can be good to go towards the other side of the aisle for a little bit.
Central planning, you see, that's how we save capitalism. A wonderful operation. The cancer was cured. Unfortunately, the patient was beheaded. So, now this idea that new technology is going to throw huge numbers of people out of work and it's a disaster, therefore we have to prevent that new technology, is a terrible and immoral argument. I mean, let me give you an example. So at the turn of the last century in America, 90% or so of people were involved in farming. Why? Because farming was largely manual labor, and therefore 90% of the entire economy was composed of people working in the agricultural sector. Now in America, that's about 2%. Now that's less than a century, that's about a century and a bit. So that's a huge shift, 90% down to less than 2%. Now, you could say, of course, oh my gosh, if we're going to get rid of 88% of the entire economy, not just a sector, the entire economy, we're going to get rid of 88% of people's jobs in the entire economy. Can you, I mean, if you look at, what a disaster, what a mess, what a butt, right? Now, of course, there were paroxysms and booms and busts and cycles and all of that in the 20th century, but they didn't really have much to do.
Right, so the argument here is that in the grand scheme of things, people are going to lose jobs, but it's not that big of a deal. People will be able to get retrained on stuff. I mean, I really don't like saying, you know, oh, go and learn how to code or something, but I get the economic argument, right? And the economic argument is it may result in a net momentarily it's going to result in a net loss for some of these truck drivers, but in the grand scheme of things, people will have more money, and this will raise all boats. So I think that is true, but you know, if you're going to just talk about economics, like I said, what about the immigration? Are we just creating a honeypot for more immigrants to come here? I think it's a serious question to ask, and I don't necessarily have the answer, but do we really just only care about the economy? Certainly the economy will help us buy a little more time, but not if we do it at the expense of doing stuff about immigration. And that's what I'm concerned about. Everything that you talk about is an opportunity cost, a lost cost. You could be talking about doing something on immigration, and I don't think Tucker actually did a good enough job on that. Like that should be where people are always coming back to, is how is this going to affect us in this multicultural world? You know, don't just philosophize in an abstract box. We're talking about real world policies, so let's look at what the real world consequence will be. And the fact is, because of the welfare state, it's going to benefit non-whites at the expense of whites. And it's also going to, as Tucker said, possibly have a further negative impact on marriage rates. Are we willing to pay these prices just to get a better GDP? I think it's worth asking that question. The other thing I'll say is, like, I don't like the idea, this whole giving the government power. I think it's misleading, right? Like, since when did Steph become a minarchist, right? I thought he was an anarcho-capitalist, and so is he saying that the government doesn't already have power because of the military? No, I think if you pushed him, he would admit that the government already has this power. It's just they are looking to see what they can get away with, and it seems like they are able to get away with more and more. But you know, are we, because we do this one thing with the government, that's going to, in some abstract and all-encompassing way, just unlock this flood of government power? It's like, no, government power is here. It's been building up, and it certainly could get worse. I'm not saying it couldn't, but you know, how is enacting a particular policy going to make things worse? Well, I guess because it sets a precedent. But frankly, our enemies don't care about precedent, right? They'll just do what they can get away with. And so we need to show them that they can get away with some things that help us, and they can't get away with the things that hurt us. It's as simple as that.
With the free market, they had to do with Federal Reserve control of interest rates and money supply, and the odd war, and the fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt put in massive government programs and huge government controls and massive union reinforcing restrictions on labor mobility during the 13-year Great Depression that culminated in the god-awful 50 million man and woman slaughter of the Second World War. So the idea that, well, you see all of these problems that to do with the free market is false. It's not true at all. So you could say, wow, you know, if you invent farm machinery, you get combine harvesters and so on, by gosh, you are going to put 88% of the men in this country out of work. So we can't allow for farm machinery. See, it's far more. It's far more than what's going to happen with driverless cars. And nobody sits there and says, well, you know, what we need to do is ban farm machinery so everyone has a job, because we understand, those of us who are reasonable.
Yeah, so he's talking about a different time, right? We're not saying, if this was an all-white country, what would you do? Or if this was a mostly white country, what would you do? We're talking about where we are at this current time, and that, you know, it's just a different thing. The Industrial Revolution and everything, I'm not a Luddite, right? I'm not just saying that I would not have wanted these technologies to come about, right? I'm using technology. So obviously, I do care about technology. And as I said earlier, I don't necessarily think it should be a ban. I know some people were criticizing me, you know, for talking about welfare. Well, if you're going to criticize welfare, then fine, let's take down the welfare and allow driverless cars. I would love that. I would love that, right? But that's the question wasn't about welfare. So yeah, we just have to be nuanced about these things, I think. That's all I'm saying. I'm not necessarily saying I agree completely with Tucker that you know, ban them in a heartbeat, right? I understand the arguments.
Simply well educated in morality, private property, free market principles, voluntarism, we understand that that would be terrible. It would make everyone poor to ban farm machinery, everybody going back. Like, you can mow your grass, if you've got a big lawn, you can mow it with an electric mower, a gas mower, or you can mow it by hand, with a hand mower, which I have done, and it's really not very pretty. Or, you see, what you can do is you can get a pair of pinking shears, or children's scissors, or a nail file to cut. Wow, you're going to be really busy all day. Is it going to be productive? No. So this idea, well, I like machinery, I like the free market, but we have to ban all these driverless cars because people have jobs already. Come on. And it's so sad. It's so ridiculous. Like, if people...
This is kind of unrelated to what he's just talking about, but he's, going over it again. So I will say something else that I noticed, which is that Tucker made this great point in the interview. He said, "We are not willing to admit that we're an empire." And the context of this quote was the Iraq War. And a lot of people have come around on the Iraq War, myself included. I used to be kind of a neocon, supporting Bush and so on, before I was into libertarianism. But, yeah, we're not... It's such a poignant idea. Like, here's what he says. He says, the Roman Empire and so on, the Turkish Empire, all of these empires, they knew that they were empires, and they were honest about it. They went out and they conquered people. But we don't do that. We have this falsity about us. This go out and drop bombs on countries in the Middle East. For why? I don't know, because it helps Israel or something? It's like, yeah, people, well, supposedly it's, the line you always hear is, it's for democracy. We're doing it for democracy, protect democracy. But there are examples of democracies that we don't intervene in, like, I don't know, Honduras or El Salvador or something. And why is that? Well, because we like the people that are there. That's why. It has nothing to do with principles. And I think people are starting to see that, so they're just fed up with this falsity. They would rather see an empire with just complete powers that's open about it than be lied to constantly. And I get that. I don't know if I necessarily 100% agree with it, but I certainly get that there's that temptation, and we're fed up with the lies and the mistrust. So that doesn't relate necessarily to driverless cars, but I wanted to point that out because he did a good job of talking about that issue.
People want to understand how the free market works. Fear-mongering is pathetic, and fear-mongering is anti-intellectual. It's a way to attempt to use scary syllables to tickle the fight-or-flight mechanism so people run away from freedom.
So what is the principle there? Is it anytime you're using emotion to push for freedom, which that itself is kind of one of these words that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but anytime you're pushing for freedom, you're in the right, and you can use fear-mongering, but when you're not pushing for freedom, then it's a bad thing. This part is kind of disappointing, because it is just a rhetorical thing, a little trick that he is doing, and I understand why. Maybe he thinks it's justified and it's necessary, but I don't think it's the best philosophical argument to say that this is fear-mongering or whatever. Like, tell me why the fear is not rational. And I think maybe he's getting to that here.
Cattle prod straight into the fight or flight, straight into the hypothalamus, and boom, you just recoil. It's horrible and it's tragic. See, I notice, you just look in the mirror. If you want to understand what freedom is, just look in the mirror, look at what you want, and look at what you do. So Tucker Carlson, interestingly enough, distributes his show on YouTube, distributes his show on television, and I assume a bunch of other online outlets, maybe even the podcast, I don't know. See, Tucker Carlson doesn't record a show and then rely on DVDs or CDs or VHS tapes for that matter in order to distribute his show. See, if he didn't use YouTube, if he didn't use television, I forget the television, let's just say YouTube, because people want to see his show, they can't figure it out how to get it, or they can't get it, they're not by the TV when it happens, so he could sell DVDs, let's say. Now, if he sold a lot of DVDs rather than putting his show on YouTube, what would happen, you see, is a lot of truckers would be required to deliver those DVDs to people's houses. Ooh, that's interesting. So,
okay. Let's talk about a different issue here. Let's talk about a different but similar issue, which is the alternative media, right? So the alternative media relies on a lot of these technologies and so on. But I'm rooting for the alternative media to win out against the mainstream media. Now, the primary reason that I'm rooting for the alternative media against the mainstream media isn't because it's going to help the economy. It isn't because of some abstract thing about freedom. It's because I think the alternative media has a lot more validity to their arguments, and because of the okay, they're not all like completely moral people. There's some kind of scummy people out there, sure, but compared to the mainstream media, holy cow, it's night and day. The mainstream media will lie, stab you in the back. I mean, that's why we have the fake news meme. It's because you saw with this Honduran person or whatever, the Mexican, whatever they were, with her kids and her Frozen shirt. And it was all shown to be just a staged thing that the media was doing to get that picture. And this is something that goes back a long time. Go back to the turn of the 20th century, the 1890s, when you had the New York World or something, and then another New York journal, and they went with the Cuban Revolution there. They were sending people in to get that perfect photograph, and they just wanted to. There's actually a quote out there about, I don't care if there is, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't care if the war is real or not, give me a photograph, a compelling photograph, and I will give you the war, right? So, yeah, they're scum, and, whether they're doing it for clicks or money, whatever their intentions, I don't care, frankly. It's irrelevant. They need to be destroyed, and not because it's going to boost the economy, although that will probably happen as well. So there, it's a very clear-cut issue. Stefan would agree with that, Tucker would agree with that, we're all on the same page. This isn't as clear-cut of an issue because it's not necessarily good people who are going to be harmed by this. I mean, I'm sorry, it probably is more good people who are going to be harmed than bad people. And we want to see bad people harmed when we live in an environment where they have a lot of power. So I just thought that comparison was interesting there. Let's continue.
So by putting his show on YouTube, Tucker Carlson is denying truckers income, is denying truckers their value. He's driving down the wages of truckers by lowering the demand for their services by putting his stuff out online. But you see, the fact that he is willing to shaft truckers by making his stuff available online doesn't have anything to do with anything. We should ban driverless trucks because we really care about the truckers. But how much does Tucker Carlson care about the truckers? Well, he will distribute his show online rather than hire truckers. Now,
right. So I think the point is, what this comes down to is that people, once a technology is in place, there's really no putting it back in the box. And so people are using it all the time, and there's not much you can do about it, right? It's not like Tucker not having a show would actually increase the sales of, or not putting his show on the internet but distributing it by trucks. Okay, that's going to help a few truckers, right? But of course, once everyone is using the product, well, the technology, you have to do that if you want to compete. So yeah, Stefan knows that, and that's the question, though. Do we want to get into a position in the future where you have to use driverless cars if you want to compete with someone? It's, I'm not going to say this is the same example, but people may know JF Gerepi has been talking about the revolutionary phenotype, and that's very interesting too, because he is kind of engaging in fear-mongering when he talks about this thing. And I haven't read his book yet. It's not out completely, but he's done some videos on it, and that's very interesting, right? Because he's fear-mongering. He's looking down the line and saying, he's projecting into the future and saying, if we do this, there will have these series of circumstances that will be disastrous. So it's kind of the same thing that he's doing, but just obviously on a much worse scale. I don't think anybody's saying, if you allow driverless cars, that is going to be the end of the white race or something like that. But it will push us in that direction. So that's why I'm not completely on board with it, right? I want to look at our options, and if it means, I'm not saying like we'll never have driverless cars in the future, but maybe we do want to put a temporary hold on that for now until we can get a hold on things like welfare and our borders. Why is that such an unreasonable thing that doesn't look at the facts? Okay.
Ben Shapiro, not great. Not great. And he, when you get that level of emotional bombast from someone, you have to meet it with moral outrage. You can't just back off and say, well, but we got a free market principle and slippery slope and this. You got to say, no, that's terrible what you're talking about. We're talking about giving the government the power to put guns against the head of people who want to start an industry and throw them in jail if they try to start that industry. That's evil. That's immoral, what you're talking about, Tucker. That's the initiation of the use of force against peaceful people who simply want to provide a service in the free market. What you're talking about, you see, Tucker, this is the trick that the communists do, is they will try and trick you into fascism as a response to communism. You see, so public control but private ownership of the means of production, that's fascism. Public control and public ownership of the means of production, that's communism. But you see, public control but private ownership of the means of production, that's fascism. So if you want the guy...
Well, okay, so... Wait, let me see if I can switch here. Ah, yes. I'm big now. Okay. Oh, no, I lost it. Okay. The trap, right? They're trapping us. I completely agree. They're trying to trap us. But the solution isn't to go the extreme other way either, because that's why there's a trap. They've got us surrounded. If we do one thing, we're screwed. If we do another thing, we're screwed. That's the system. Some people call it a certain kind of sandwich that's very healthy and it comes with a little K on it. But that's the sandwich they're trying to squish us in. And maybe we need to trap them. Have you ever thought of that? Like, why are we always reacting to them? Why can't we corner and trap the communists, the globalists? Why can't we be the ones who are setting these things up and saying, no, we're going to use the government to do something that's good for us where it comes, and push back where it's bad. We're going to use private corporations and competition to do things that are good for us. And, you know, because it's a war. And if you're just reacting, now it's not yet a physical war, and I'm glad for that, but it is a war. And I think Stefan should know this by now, the number of times he's been attacked. And so what is he suggesting that we do if we're just reacting all the time to, okay, if we do this, we're going to give the government more power, so we can't do that, so we have to do this other thing that is just going to lead us into more of the same trap. Now, of course, he would say, well, let's get rid of the government, right? And okay, I want to get rid of the government too. A lot of the nationalists are not with me on this, and I do have more of a nuanced position, because I would say it's not so much getting rid of government and what government does, but it's allowing people to be able to secede in the future, guaranteeing that right for any group of people. But yes, the government is coercive, so let's acknowledge that. But then once you acknowledge that, it's not like anytime you are advocating for a policy which uses the government, you know, the libertarians will say that putting troops on the border or enforcing our borders is using the government, right? Now, Stefan pushes back on that, right? He says, well, no, in the long run, this is actually, I mean, yes, technically you're using the government, but you're using the government to get rid of like another government program. And so I'm not saying, again, driverless cars, ban them outright, but we should at least be able to look at possibilities to use the government to get what we want.
Government to control which industries last and which industries don't last and what's allowed and what's not allowed. That's central planning. So they've tricked you into fascism as a response to communism, and therefore both squeeze and destroy the free market. And Tucker should know that by now. Good heavens. He's So Tucker Carlson says, Ben Shapiro says, well, people can move. If there's no jobs where they are, people can move. And I mean, Tucker Carlson leaving no emotionally manipulative stone unturned, says, so they must pick up and leave the graves of their fathers and their mothers. And it's like, so, you know, just out of curiosity, if moving for economic opportunity is so terrible, well, then, of course, Tucker Carlson should want completely closed borders, because, you see, the people who come to America are certainly leaving the graves of their fathers and mothers, not even in the same country, but for India and Pakistan and Somalia and Libya and you name it. They're leaving the graves of their fathers. That's terrible. People shouldn't move for economic reasons, so close the borders. No immigration. I don't know, maybe he is, but I doubt it.
I'm pretty sure he is. Pretty sure Tucker would be okay with closing the borders, but I haven't asked him myself, so.
Leave the graves of their fathers. So, just out of curiosity, I looked up Tucker Carlson. See, he thinks it's just horrifying, you see, that people might want to move for the sake of economic opportunity, because they will leave the aforementioned graves of their fathers and their mothers. So Tucker Carlson, interestingly enough, has constantly moved to pursue job opportunities as a broadcaster and as a columnist and so on. So I don't even know, like, how do you explain these things? Look in the mirror, see what you're doing, and that probably has a lot to do with what other people wouldn't mind doing either. So you see, it's fine for Tucker Carlson to move to pursue economic opportunities, but for other people, it's uprooting them from their deeply held and foundational communities, and they're spitting and shitting on the graves of their mothers and their fathers, and it's like, come on, man.
Well, you know, this frankly does have a lot to do with the agrarian versus the city life, right? Because if you want to, you know, there's only so many things you can do out in the rural environment. And so, yeah, it is a big adjustment. I mean, I don't want to belittle that, right? And I think that, again, it goes back to health. Like, if we are putting a lot of people in the environments where they are likely to become indoctrinated, and, you know, just, okay, think about this for a second. The college educated people, even among whites, tend to go more towards the Democratic side of things, right? And so the ones who vote Republican the strongest are actually those who haven't gone to college, right? So what does this leave people with? Okay, if there can't be truck drivers, and there are a lot of truck drivers, I think that's one of the reasons this debate is such like a hotly contested issue. It's not just a small fraction of people. So these people, somehow they are going to have, let's say they do retrain, right? Because there's only so many manual jobs you can do, and also that's a problem with immigration too. Like, if you wanted to say, we're going to deport all of the illegals and at the same time allow for these driverless cars, then bam, you've got a perfect solution, because the truck drivers will be out of a job, but all of these other manual labor jobs will be cleaned up, will be open, and so people can go and do the yard work again. But they can't compete because we've got you've got people sending remittances back, and you've just got and they're getting these visas. It's definitely a net negative on the working person, right? So if you don't do something shifty, or if you don't do something clever like that, then what you're left with is these people are going to have to probably get education, right? And what is the kind of education that's out there? Well, it's all leftist indoctrination. I mean, even the technical stuff that I mean, yeah, you can become an electrician, and there's still need for those type of jobs. So I'm not saying they're completely out of luck, but a certain number of these people will probably go to college. They're going to go to university, and what are they going to learn there? Are they going to become? Is the average person going to be more likely to continue to be a Republican, or are they going to move to the left, like we've seen? I think it's something to consider and address, and to just say, well, it's the free market, and I think that you're not looking at the war strategically. I think Stefan might be actually walking into their trap. We both agree there's a trap, but we just think the way out of it is slightly different, if you will.
Look in the mirror! You moved to pursue economic opportunities. Nothing wrong with other people doing it. So, this idea that if you have a bunch of people who are all suddenly, quote, out of work, what are you going to do with them? How could this possibly be handled? But it has been handled in the past. So let's look at the end of the Second World War. So at the end of the Second World War, the United States had more than 12 million men and, brackets, women, in the armed forces. So 12 million men. And of course, think of all of the other men and, bracket, women who were involved in supplying the armed forces and this, that, and the other, right? So there are millions and millions, tens of millions of people either directly in the armed forces or in industries working to supply the armed forces in the Second World War. Tens of millions of people. 7.6 million of the men were stationed abroad. So a funny thing happened. At the end of the Second World War, you had tens of millions of people whose jobs evaporated, either directly as soldiers or indirectly in supplying the military-industrial complex. Tens of millions of men and a couple of women, all their jobs evaporated. Now, there was all of these plans. All of these plans say, oh, we got...
and keep in mind, again, like the end of the Second World War, the 1950s, what was the white population of America? Well, we still had a super majority, and because of that, it's not that the struggle over jobs was not a racial one. I think it's fair to say that at the end of the Second World War, it wasn't that your job is going to get taken over by Paco, someone, right? And this is a serious concern because obviously if you have less economic potential, you have less opportunity to have children. So economics is, it's not just like this fun little game. It has real world consequences involving a population and involving demographics. And if you just look at it strictly on economics and you don't look at how it affects demographics, then I think you're just living in a different time, and you're kind of like wanting to go back to the 1980s or something with Ronald Reagan and who helped bring about this reality with his amnesty in California. And I don't want to have to see everything through a racial lens, but I do. And I've been forced into that because of these people who are trying to trap us, as you say.
Got to have this big giant government agency to match up people returning home from the war to their job opportunities and make sure that everyone, right? Chaos, panic, nastiness, right? People got jobs like that. The prosperity of the 50s came out of the relative free market that occurred in the 40s, mid to late 40s, after the end of the Second World War. By the time they had even thought about getting some plans going with the government job resettlement program, or whatever the hell it was called, everyone had come home and found jobs already. Tens of millions of people whose jobs completely vanished, and there was virtually no transitional difficulty. So that's kind of important. There is a mess in the American economy, as there is in the West, and the mess has to do with a whole...
Okay, so let me skip ahead here a little bit.
You get knocked up and raise your kids without a father to make sure you get child benefits and so on, but everyone's got kind of stuck. It is kind of funny to me as well that Tucker Carlson says, you will leave the grave of your fathers to that, right? Well, America, of course, was founded by people who left the grave of their fathers and traveled across an entirely exquisitely dangerous and disease-infected crossing across the Atlantic to get to America. But you see now, people can't move from Idaho to Kansas because, I don't know, the ghosts of their parents follow them. I don't know. So there is that mess. Of course, we have paid a lot of irresponsible people to have children.
So I would say that the reason people can't move now is because we've replaced the founding stock, right? A lot of people, they don't want to go to New York, right? It's not going to be to them and their families' best interest to have to move into a city. And well, I don't know. This is just, I mean, so think about truck drivers. They're used to. It's actually kind of funny that it says that they're not willing to move, right? Truck drivers are always on the move, of course, and so I think what's happening here. And thank you for bearing with me. But like, I think what's happening is that he's not actually understanding what Tucker is saying when he talks about, uprooting them and taking them out of their history and their culture, because it isn't just about them wanting to be in in the area or location that their grandparents or whatever were, and that certainly is the case now that we are a more mobile society. And I know I didn't stay in the town that I was born in, and that's very common for people in my generation. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing either. Yeah, I mean, frankly, we do have more freedom in that sense. We're able to move around. People, yeah, you're not sort of tied to the city that you're born in and where you just work. I think to some degree people back then also wanted that lifestyle. So it's a mix. But the main point that I was trying to make is that because of immigration and so on, we are more limited, right? Think about white flight. People move. So people are willing to move, not just. People are willing to move not just because they lost their job, right? People are willing to move just to get away from certain groups of people. And so it's not so much that we don't want to move, it's that we don't feel we have places to move to that are going to be conducive to our kind of lifestyle. And that's because of the forced diversity and the affirmative action, the anti-white propaganda that's everywhere. We are still a majority and there's still a big country out there, but you know, every year it's just becoming less and less. They import people into everywhere. Iowa, you know, Wisconsin, no place is immune to it. So eventually we're going to run out of places to flee to. And that's really what's not being said here, is that people care far more about their quality of life, I think, rather than just the economics of things. Most people, I mean, you do have the urbanites who are willing to put up with the multiculturalism, but for the rest of us who just want to live in a nice white neighborhood, it's becoming harder and harder. And one of the nice things about truck driving was that you can basically live anywhere. I think that the internet does help that a lot, and so as the newer generations mature and they've been around the internet for a long time, that will sort of resolve itself, because there will be jobs for you on the internet, even if it's just like affiliate marketing or something like that. But I don't hear stuff talking about that, like the white flight thing, and maybe he's just missing the point of Tucker's argument about white people hurting. And, you know, maybe we can find a solution, but I would really, you know, like to be able to go to those people and not just tell them that they're not going to have a job, you know, offer suggestions. That's what a lot of people will bring people around, I think, is offering them suggestions on how they can still maintain this separation and still maintain their cohesiveness. But of course, because it's being done by the government, that can only happen for so long.
Through the welfare state and irresponsibility, lack of conscientiousness is a genetically transmitted characteristic. So we have created, it's not entirely, but there's no aspect of personality that doesn't have a significant genetic component, like IQ itself. 80% of your IQ when you're in your late teens is genetic, and nobody knows how to really alter or change it from there. So that's sort of basic reality. So it's a giant mess. It's a giant mess. And the entire, I mean, the entire interstate road system. I know I'm going back, but this is the root of these kinds of problems. Like, if you want to look at the root of the problem of healthcare insurance, you have to go back to the fact that in the Second World War, companies weren't allowed by the government to give raises to their employees, so they decided to pay their health insurance instead. That's the only reason why your health insurance is bound to your job, which creates a lot of power for the employers now, because if they fire you, you lose your health insurance, and if you've got pre-existing conditions, that makes you very easy to control and very easy to dominate and very easy to bully from an economic standpoint. But it's a result of a government program. It's not the result of the free market. So if you go back, the entire interstate highway system was built largely by Eisenhower as a way of allowing the army to move around America in the event of a nuclear.
Yeah, and that's frankly just a result of where we are now with this, with people wanting more socialism, it seems. And I sympathize. Like, I'm not a socialist. I don't want socialism. I do, however, think that there's this strand within the white population which does like socialism and nationalism. And so this is sort of opinion time here. How do you deal with that? Because the fact of the matter is we live in a democracy, and in order to get elected, you have to kind of push more of these populist messages. And we see Trump even, venturing into the realm of, single payer or something, that the more democratic, the former Democrats who are coming over to the Republican Party, but they really do like socialism. We have this strand. Now, why do we have this? Is it because we allowed all these immigrants from Europe to come here? That's very possibly the case, because socialism was kind of killed out of the early Americans. If you look at my illustrated video with Ron Paul, one of the earliest ones, he was telling this story of the Pilgrims, and they set up this socialist colony with William Bradford, and in the end it failed miserably, and they said, okay, now we're going to give people private property. And so to what degree did that early experiment kind of condition that first founding stock of Americans to be adverse to socialism? I think you could definitely make that case, but that founding stock has been diluted, and so yeah, we do definitely have this socialist strain. And how do we get around that? It'd be nice to say we can convince people out of it. One of the best things I think that you can do to counteract that is to say, look, we can't have these socialist programs right now because we have multiculturalism, and that snaps people out of it immediately. Because they're more nationalist, they don't want their gibs. I mean, their money to be going as gibs to these minorities. So it does make people more right-wing as a whole. And so when you have a video like this, which is only talking about libertarian economics, and you're not really bringing in the picture of immigration. I understand Steph talks a lot about immigration, but just for the sake of this video, like, there's definitely people who are going to hear this and they're not going to be convinced. You could wish it was different. You could wish that the arguments did more to sway people. But if you're looking for a peaceful solution to, swerve people away from the cliff edge, so to speak, you have to kind of speak their language a little bit. And that's not the language that Stefan is speaking, for sure. It's the language of, maybe Murray Rothbard or some of the other libertarian intellectuals that have had an influence on him, had an influence on me. But at a certain point, you do want to, you want to do whatever you can to win and to sway people away from just falling into or just giving in to the neoliberal establishment or some kind of I think I'll leave it there. Okay, let's go on.
Nuclear war. It's still being paid for, by the way. I did a speech on this some years ago in Philadelphia, I think. So the entire interstate highway system was not economically driven by free market requirements. It was just a giant government program that made America very spread out, very reliant on cars, and made trucking a big industry that it otherwise would not have been as much of. Driverless trucks will be safer. Well, we know that because the only way that insurance companies will insure driverless trucks is if they're safer than human beings. So how many people do you think should die at the hands of truck drivers falling asleep or being inattentive or checking Twitter while they rocket along at 60 miles an hour or 55 miles an hour? Who knows, right? So...
Okay, he says driverless cars will be safer. I have no doubt that that will be the case, you know. Friend of mine who's more knowledgeable on this topic has definitely said that he thinks that would be the case. You clear up a lot of traffic. You would, fewer accidents, fewer people would die, less drunk driving. I mean, basically eliminate drunk driving. So it's easy to see the positive benefits. I'm not denying that there are positive benefits. But let me give you another possibility. Since we're thinking about the long-term consequences, what effect will this have? Now, at first, you're going to get these positive, right? The whole thing with insurance being a lot cheaper. That will, a lot of people will like it, right? But what about 10 years? What about 20 years down the road when driverless cars have basically, taken over most of the highways, the automobiles that are existing now, because it will be a gradual thing. It's not going to happen. They're not just going to replace everything. There's no way they could. But think about this. Social media platforms are now, Twitter and so on, are banning people like Jared Taylor. They're banning people like Alex Jones. And can you imagine a scenario in which you go to get into your, you dial your driverless car or whatever it is, and you get this message that pops up and says, "We're sorry, your feature has been disabled for hate speech. You will no longer have access to our system." Wow. So now it's not just you can't communicate to the world. Now you can't even go places. I mean, it sounds dystopia, like a dystopia, but the fact of the matter is we live in a very we live in a globalized world, and in a globalized world, these big mega corporations come and they start buying up other corporations. Now, I know I sound like a leftist criticizing the corporations, but frankly, there's a lot of corporations that are crony. They don't have the interests of the common people like you and me in heart, and they're in bed with the government. They lobby the government to get what they want. Everything goes through the government. We're just at that stage, right? So how... I can certainly imagine this scenario in the future where you're just not even allowed to go to the grocery store anymore because you said something racist on the internet. I mean, it sounds fantastical, but just think about it. And of course you could say, well, there will be competitors. There will be competitors. Oh, you mean like Gab? Like Gab, which they're trying to get shut down now because somebody on there said something that might have led somebody to go and commit a hate crime against Jewish people. We're playing with fire here, and I don't know what the perfect solution is, but we need to at least present these as possibilities, and I think give people some pause for what the possibilities are. I think this is actually even a stronger argument than the fact that people will be out of a job, right? I don't think that's the strongest argument here. It's too bad Tucker Carlson didn't go there, but of course immediately Ben Shapiro would say, oh, you're just like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. No, nobody's gonna get banned for hate speech for driving a car. Come on. And of course, that's what always happens, right? They always say this is never going to happen. Oh, no, it's going, transgenderism, never going to happen. It's going to stop with gay marriage. We promise. It never does. It never does. So I just want people to think about this.
Oh, that's an important principle. And the principle as well, putting a robot truck on the road is not a violation of the non-aggression principle, right? The non-aggression principle, also known as the porcupine principle of self-defense, says you're only allowed to use force in self-defense. You can't initiate the use of force against someone else. Putting a robot truck on the road is not an act of criminal aggression against someone else. So then, of course, what people say is, okay, well, let's say we allow these government trucks, we allow these driverless trucks out on the road. Well, you see, there's all these people are going to be thrown out of work, so now we need a big, giant government program to retrain them for other industries, which is a terrible idea. First of all, the government doesn't have any clue what job requirements are out there. It doesn't have any clue what...
I just want to point out real quick that I don't recall Tucker bringing up retraining them. I don't think he actually did bring up the idea of retraining them. Now, obviously, they're going to have to find something else to do. But that, I've already talked about the whole immigration and people, the Mexicans stealing our jobs and stuff.
What new industries are emerging. Anybody who knows for sure which new industries are emerging are not in a million years working for the government. You know what they're doing? They're investing their own money to make themselves multi-zillionaires. Because if you are the kind of person who can figure out which are the new industries and which are going to grow and which are going to be economically valuable, then you shouldn't be an investor. You're not going to be a bureaucrat in some government program. So they're going to take billions and billions of dollars out of the economy to train people for jobs that will never materialize. And those jobs, even more jobs would have materialized if they hadn't taken billions of dollars out of the economy to train people for jobs that aren't there. So I'm sorry, like, I wish there was a magic, bloody, violent laser Glock wand that we could wave to make the world a paradise by pointing guns at people, but we can't. It just doesn't work.
Wow. Okay, make the world a paradise by pointing guns at people. Is that Tucker's argument? I don't think so. I don't think he's saying that. Well, okay. The thing about guns. I mean, yes. Okay, we get it. The government is force. The government's violence. We all understand that. And the fact is, there are guns being used. There are guns being used. Who's going to be using them? Frankly, like, there are tons of other things where the government, like, there are so many other things you could go and rail against that the government is using guns to do bad things with, and it would also help us who are trying to bring back our nation and trying to rebuild it, right? So there are issues where you can be a libertarian and still, you know, go for nationalist issues. Anti-war is one of those. The economy is a trickier thing, right? I think it's a balancing act. Do we want to have the best economy and keep pushing things forward? I don't know. Like, is that just giving those who are in power more string, more, you know, if you give someone enough rope to hang themselves with, eventually the rope's too long and they can't. That's a bad analogy. Let me continue.
So here's the basic fact. Once the technology is invented, people are going to use it. They're going to use it around the world. They're going to use it in China. They're going to use it in India. They're going to use it in Hong Kong. They're going to use it all over the place. So how are you going to ban driverless trucks in your own economic environment without, and also ban it overseas so that nobody can compete with you? So let's just take a little quick example, and this is all just made up numbers, but I hope you get the principle.
Well, okay, if it has no effect, if I'm a little confused here, because if banning them here, like if it's inevitable to stop it from getting here, why does it matter if we ban them or not? Let me see let me go on. I didn't get it.
So let's say that there's a $1,000 computer, and let's say that 10% of the cost of that $1,000 computer is driving. It's the truck that has to drive it all over the place, right? So let's say that driverless trucks save 50% off that 10%. So now you're saving $50 on your $1,000 computer. So if you use driverless trucks, your $1,000 computer is now only $950. That's pretty good, right? And so then what has us a 5% saving? Could be higher, could be lower, doesn't really matter, right? So you got $1,000 in your pocket. You're going to go and buy the computer. You get to the store, and it's $950. So you pay your $950. You got your $50 left over in your pocket, right? What are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it? Well, you're going to go spend it somewhere else, probably, right? Or you're going to go and put it...
Okay. So he says it's going to be used elsewhere. It's going to be used all over the place. I think that might be an exact quote. Going to be used all over the place. So what he's saying is that the globalists are going to use driverless cars all over the world. And things are going to become more integrated, right? Things are going to become more centralized. Because not that I don't know of anyone who's talking about cryptocurrency, putting driverless cars on the blockchain. Now maybe that would happen, and that would probably change my opinion quite. That would sway me quite a lot, because I frankly look at everything through the view of centralization. And just because there's a technology that comes about that's revolutionary, it doesn't mean it's not going to be harnessed by a small group of people to oppress a much larger group of people. And I use the word oppress in, frankly, a cultural sense, not necessarily in the sense of, using the government to do it, although they certainly will. So, let me just say this. Is this technology being used all over the place going to bring us closer or farther away from one world government? Because that's where they want to go. They want to get rid of nations. Now you might say, well, how would that work? Like, just because we have driverless cars doesn't mean that we can't have nations or anything. But it is part of this standardization thing, which destroys our culture. And I would love to live in a society where I chose that government. And I would love to live in a society where I had the ability to choose a government that would intentionally, prevent these kinds of things from having an effect on my society, and that would not violate anyone's freedom because I'm choosing that particular government. It's I don't know, you could think of it as like voluntary fascism, which I know Steph has said, like, he criticizes Ayn Rand. How could you have a voluntary government? And he doesn't accept this idea, which is partly where I part ways with him, but I think it is possible through guaranteed secession. So that is ultimately where I would like to live, and you can, through that, you can preserve your culture, you can preserve nations, you can preserve decentralization, but you can also have a moral way and a non-coercive way of doing it. So, I would just encourage libertarians out there to start thinking in that mindset. What would I like the government to do if I was able to choose it? Because nobody really thinks about this. We just assume, oh, you're born into a place and you don't really get to choose a government, or you don't get to choose to separate from a government because they've got the guns. I don't think it has to be that way. So yeah, I'm opposed to centralization, and even if it means my nation has to use a bit of that government force, I would generally say that's better than going on a path towards one world government.
In the bank, in which case the bank may lend it out to other entrepreneurs to build businesses or whatever, right? Even if you stick it under a mattress, you're incrementally raising the value of everyone else's money by taking yours out of circulation. A tiny, tiny bit, but it's still there. There's nothing you can do really with that money that isn't going to make something more valuable somewhere else in the economy. So the $50, like everyone sees, oh, the truck drivers lose their jobs. I say, oh, well, the price of computers goes down a little bit. But then what happens is you take that money, you spend it on other things.
Real quick here, somebody in the chat says, it wouldn't be called government in that case. And that's probably what Steph would say. Okay, I mean, I don't really agree. I draw this distinction between a state and a government. And if, you know, I've had Chase Rachels on here, who is an ANCAP, and he's talked about this a little bit, but I personally don't see, like, government means to govern. I don't see how that necessarily has to be like with complete control, like where you don't grant the right to leave. Maybe you differ. Maybe it's just a grammatic thing, and if that's the case, so be it.
Right, so let's say you go and buy a sound card for your new computer. Okay, well, now there's jobs in the sound card factory. Let's say that you go out for lunch. Well, now there's restaurant jobs. Let's say, whatever, it could be any number of things, right? So that $50 extra, that's called economic growth, which means you're producing the same good, a computer, for $50 less. That's how the economy grows. That's why we have any kind of wealth at all. And the only way to achieve those gains in any kind of consistent way is to allow for the free market to operate. So,
all right. Well, I think he is again acting kind of in an abstract box. Like this is how things should work in this box, and if we have a free market. But Steph knows very well that we don't have a free market right now. We have remnants of a free market. And so we have this thing called the Federal Reserve, and that is taking away purchasing power from people, right? Through inflation, through money printing. And the fact is, very often the people, who benefits from that? Well, certainly the truck drivers aren't benefiting from the Federal Reserve, right? No, it's going to be people on Wall Street, people who are very close to the point at which government starts to inject this money into the economy. And so he knows very well that the working class, they're getting shafted. And so that additional $50 that he mentioned, that your computer is $50 cheaper because you have driverless cars to deliver it, well, that money that you have has been inflated away. And because of the decreased purchasing power caused by the Federal Reserve. And of course, Steph would join me in saying that we should get rid of the Fed and establish a free market based on sound money. But first, we have this problem of the people who control the Federal Reserve not wanting to give up the power of the Federal Reserve. And they don't. The reason they do what they do isn't like a moral thing, right? They're economic actors as well, and they're driven by incentives. So, what is the moral thing to do here? Should we give power to the Federal Reserve or give power to the truck drivers? And you may seem like you may say, well, it's not like a binary choice there, but we have to work within the context of what we have. I think that I hesitate to say that Steph is choosing to go after the truck drivers because it's because they're an easier target and he's not going to get pushback. I don't think so, because he has made plenty of videos about the Fed and the monetary policy. But maybe it is the fact that he just hasn't had a big effect in that area. And so when it comes to things that he's going to talk about the things where he can actually have a effect, and that his words will have more of an influence. But he has this thing where it's like, I don't have to pick a side here, like the working white people or the Blue Jays, the who in the Federal Reserve. I don't have to pick a side, globalist or well, I mean, he would say that he sides with nationalists, but it's when it comes to, we're talking about the monetary policy, so he doesn't really get into nationalism per se, which I think is a mistake. But he kind of thinks in the economics he can just stay neutral, and I don't know that that's a wise decision. I think I would criticize him for that, saying that just because of my standards of philosophy, I can look at this issue by itself and not have to pick a side per se.
If you ban the driverless trucks in your country, what happens is Japan or China or other places will allow the driverless trucks, and therefore their computers will be able to underbid your computers, right? So, because if you go to the store, there's an American driven by human beings computer for $1,000, and then there's a Japanese robot truck computer, that's a phrase, for $950. People are going to pay the $950 one. And what that means is that the American computer companies are going to go out of business, which means more people get thrown out of work. What that means then is the American computer companies don't need truckers because they're out of business, so there's fewer jobs for truckers. Like, doesn't matter. They're going to go out. Once the technology's there, I don't mean to sound helpless, but there's no economic dictator around the world, although I'm sure the EU's trying. It's just the reality of how things play out in the free market.
Again, this is kind of confusing about it's inevitable or something. Like, if it's inevitable, then there's no point in talking about whether we should ban it or not. I don't know. It kind of reminds me of like, oh, I'm on the right side of history or something. I mean, sure, other people might do it, but this kind of goes back to the tariffs thing. It's like the free market economists, want complete free trade, and I recognize their arguments with economics. Yes, it's probably ultimately better if everyone in the world has complete free trade. Guess what? Everyone in the world doesn't have complete free trade. So for a long time, America was getting ripped off on their import-export. China was charging us to, excuse me. I told you in the first episode I was going to be a burper. Anyway, so China is definitely taking advantage and has been taking advantage of us, at least until Trump came along and started to talk tough about tariffs. And all of a sudden, when Trump started talking tough about tariffs, what do you know? Other people were opening up. Oh, maybe free trade could be a good thing. So he ultimately actually got us closer to the free traders, what they want. Because just yelling at other countries, frankly, it doesn't do any good. Like, they are seeking power and benefit for themselves. So you have to incentivize them, threaten them even. Now, hopefully not. I think the sanctions is kind of a dumb thing, but that's another issue. So I think there are some similarities here with this economic debate about the driverless trucks, because we are saying it will be a global thing, and I think we can't just look at this in the context of domestic, like how it's going to affect us domestically.
Because this is the basic intelligence test that the free market requires. Like, there's no accident all these people from the third world are voting for socialism. All the people from Mexico are voting for socialism because they come from low IQ groups, and low IQ groups want stuff in the here and now. It's an intelligence test to say, are you pro-socialism to the average person? The elites, they're all about management and control. It's another matter. But the average person, if they say, wow, I really want free university, right? What's an intelligence test? Do you believe there's such a thing as free? Well, if you do, it's hard to make the case you should be free to vote, but no, there's no such thing as free. If people say...
Here is where I would disagree with him. Intelligence test. I mean, again, is intelligence just a proxy for something else here? It's very easy to say, you know, I'm on the side of smart people or something, because then you don't have to talk about race, and there's also a lot of smart people who are not doing good things in the world. So I don't put, that's why I don't focus solely on IQ, intelligence. It's because I think that there are more important things than intelligence. You know, what about goodness? What about righteousness? What about the ability to preserve your people? So I don't think it's an intelligence test. I think it's a tribalist test. It's existential. It's a person's genes saying that, so this group at the top, who is not the same DNA as me, is going, if they're allowed to do what they want to do, they're going to basically wipe out my genes and the genes of those people who are similar to me. Right? I don't think that the middle Americans, they're not really able to articulate this in so many words, but I think they're at some deep level feeling this and understanding that they're in this tribal conflict. And so there's kind of a street smart to that, if you will. Yeah, I mean, I think that's generally why they're supporting socialism. I don't think that it's just they really love getting free stuff and they want to stick it to these other guys. I think they're feeling something deeper that's hard to express, and that they're also not allowed to express. Like, you get fired, you get shunned, ostracized. But yeah, that's the level that the conflict is at. And when it comes to socialism, I think if you don't understand why people feel this way and make these kind of arguments, if you don't understand the tribal aspect, it's kind of like yelling at a tree for dropping its leaves. Yeah, so I would say if you really want a free market, the best way to accomplish that is, frankly, to create an ethno-state where the tribal competition isn't going to be a big factor.
I want to tax the rich more. For the most part, they're not rich. Or if they are rich, they're just trying to buy off populists by pretending that they don't have tax breaks elsewhere. So it's just like an intelligence test. Do you want the government to ban driverless trucks and keep 10 million American workers in their jobs? Well, now you've just given the government the power to ban entire industries. And you're now crippling industries that can't compete with foreign economies that use driverless trucks. Everybody goes out of business, everybody collapses, but the government power remains forever. And now every industry that's threatened
this is another thing. It's like once you give the government power, you can't possibly take it away. I think that's kind of a lie that's been told to us. It's certainly, you can certainly point to the past century or decade, and that has been the case, is that government power has grown. But how do you know that's not just because the demographics have changed? So I don't think that it's the case that someone in government, especially if it's like a monarchy or a dictator or something more hardcore than a democracy, I don't think it's the case. Like, are you saying it's impossible to have a libertarian leader who would actually want to roll back government? If that's the case, how do you explain, I hate to say it, but Adam Kokesh, who was running on a platform to abolish one step at a time or roll back things to a decentralized level? Again, not a huge fan of Adam Kokesh, but and he's probably not going to get elected. But to say that, like, this is an inevitability, government only gets more power, I understand why he says this, and this is something that has been very core to Stefan's message from the beginning, was that that Lord Acton quote, "Power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely." Well, is that always? I mean, we certainly can understand the first point is not true. Excuse me. We certainly understand that people can have power and it doesn't have to corrupt them. Stefan has a lot of power. He has also a responsibility, and he has accountability, and perhaps the problem is that government doesn't have much accountability right now. But he does have power. Now, I think the absolute thing, that's a little more true, and that is why I oppose, centralized one world government types of scenarios. I don't think that's a positive thing, and if we had a free market in governments, or whatever non-coercive word you want to use for that kind of world, I think there's no way. I don't foresee a possibility where that we could go towards a world government, because so many people will revolt, and there's so many different opinions out there. So that doesn't worry me. But I think that within nations, you can certainly roll back government. You can tell people, okay, we're going to do this thing. Let's say we wanted to, you had ultimate power over the United States, and you wanted to just close the borders and just hunker down, and then you wanted to promote, pro policies which would help restore the demographics of the country to what it started out as. Doesn't have to be any violence involved, right? These are just policies that you would make, and you could say, well, they're discriminatory and so on, and it goes against our code, and yeah. I understand. I'm just talking about a hypothetical scenario, and of course you would get pushback. You're always going to get pushback if you're a white person trying to have a white homeland. But could you do this, and then once you've done that, say, now that we have this land, we're going to have a more decentralized version of our government. We're going to change the Constitution. And of course, you can look at examples. I think I want to say Liechtenstein or something. I always get the name wrong, but it starts with an L. And there's this prince who, he's libertarian. He's a monarch, but a libertarian, and he's pushing things that writing new code into the Constitution that allows for more freedom. So I just wanted to point that out.
by growth, by progress, by competition, is going to run to the government and say, hey, you did it with the truck drivers, now you got to do it with us. I'm telling you, it's personal to me, because, again, this is an IQ test. How is this power going to be wielded against others? Well, it's quite simple. The mainstream media is dying. Yay.
And again, who is in control of that power? I don't think that's an irrelevant thing to say. Who is in control of, who has that power? It's not just like people are interchangeable and everybody's going to make the same decisions when they get into government. If that was the case, and he doesn't believe that's the case because he supported Trump. Why would he have supported Trump? Now, I understand, it's an anomaly. It's very rare that this happens because of the incentive structures. Okay. But, there's always a possibility.
Mainstream media is dying. And they're going to run to the government, and they do already in some places. The Canadian mainstream media wants money from the government and get it directly sometimes. The mainstream media is going to run to the government, and they're going to say, we're essential for democracy, like all this kind of crap, right? And they're going to say, well, you see, we're running out of money, and that's terrible. And so we need you, the government, to either give us money directly, which taxes people in the alternative media, and others, of course, to pay for all of this, or they're going to say, we want you to ban our competition. Because this whole ban driverless truck thing is just about banning competition. That's all it is. Banning competition for trucks. And if the horse and buggy manufacturers had their way, there'd be no such thing as the car. And
well, okay, but then also, building a border wall is banning competition from Mexico. It's like, is it okay to ever ban competition? Our enemies do it. They do it all the time. Just something to think about.
Tucker Carlson would be able to weep about imaginary people leaving imaginary graves for very real, tangible economic benefits. But they're going to say, well, you got to ban alternative media because they're destroying our profits, in the same way that you have to ban driverless trucks because they're destroying the profits of existing truckers. You understand? That's just how it's going to play. And people who can't see that, I'm not saying Tucker Carlson is low IQ, he's smart, but he's just not thinking things through.
He's just not thinking things through. Yeah, it's not that he's not smart. Well, of course. Okay, Steph can't say that Tucker's not smart because he's clearly a very articulate person with a high IQ. Okay, you wouldn't get to that position if you weren't smart. How do you know he hasn't thought it through? Hold on, there's one more part after this.
Or he has bad advisors, or he's just a guy who wants to keep his television show by appealing to populism and vaguely positive phrases like, I want nice people to have nice things in a nice environment.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not buying that Fox News would get rid of Tucker Carlson because he's too pro-free market. I can't really get on board with that. I don't know how that would work out. If Tucker hasn't been fired at this point, for all the things he said about race and stuff that are, forebode in the GOP, right? If Fox News still is keeping it on, they're not going to get rid of him for being on Ben Shapiro's side. Let's be honest about that.
Pretty much Aristotelian levels of political analysis right there. Because it comes down to this. In the free trade, and this is what Bastiat referred to as the seen versus the unseen. The seen versus the unseen. If lots of truckers lose their jobs, they make a big fuss because they know that their jobs are being lost and they know that it's the driverless trucks that are doing it. So they get mad and they get upset. And I understand that. That's natural. I understand that. But just because people get upset doesn't mean that you should give in to them. I mean, tantrums should not drive public policy any more than they should drive which kid gets candy, All
right. I want to give you guys a little, a new phrase, if you will. Okay, so Bastiat talks about the seen and the unseen. and it's a way of talking about how a lot of times in the economy there can be, you know, effects or decisions that happen that create benefits somewhere else, even though what you normally see is the bad. You see that because of the media and because it's in your face. So you see truck drivers getting laid off, and that's bad. And the unseen is that, like he was saying before, people are going to have more money in their pockets for things like computers because people can make it cheaper. So that's seen, and unseen comes from Frederick Bastiat. And okay, here's a new phrase that I'm going to coin here. You've got the seen and the unseen. What about the white versus the fellow white? A lot of times people only see the white, but they don't see the fellow white. Now, if you've been following along with this inquiry, I mean, a lot of people on streams, and he approached Stefan, right? And they asked him about the Blue Jay question, the BQ. And he says, you know, if you really think that there's this conspiracy or whatever, why don't you just compete with them? You know, just go out and compete. Stefan, that's what we're trying to do. That is what we're trying to do. We're trying to compete with them, and if we only compete on one playing field, which is the free market, and we don't ever compete on government, who do you think is going to win?
Convenience store. So the truckers who lose their jobs can point at the driverless trucks and say, aha, those Terminator robot transformer bastards have stolen my job. So that's the scene, and it's tangible, it's visceral, and it's... But if you allow the driverless trucks to take over, and you release tens or hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy to create new jobs, some new guy sees, walking down the street a week later, and he sees a sign in a Pizza Hut. I worked there when I was younger. He sees a sign in a Pizza Hut saying, waiters wanted. He's like, oh, all right, I can go do that. Actually, it's a pretty good job. I love that pizza, and their fettuccine was great, and the hot chocolate was good, and it was kind of crazy, though. They had these, for a while when I was working there, they had a little clock. You had to get the drinks and the pizza out within 10 minutes of people coming in for lunch, or they got a pizza for free. Kind of crazy, but good tips for the most part, which was pretty essential. And this is back in the days of change when nobody really used a lot of credit cards, so you'd end up walking around like a pockets from people's tips. But anyway, so the guy's going down the street. He sees a sign in the Pizza Hut window that says, waiter wanted. He goes in, he gets a job as a waiter, and he starts his whole career, as I did. Started working in a bookstore, and then got a paper route, and then cleaned offices, and worked in a hardware store, and worked in a shelving store, and worked in a couple of restaurants. It's just how you get started in your economic journey to hopefully some decent solvency in middle age. So he sees that sign, he goes in, and he gets a job. Now, he doesn't sit there and say, aha, I know that job only exists because those driverless trucks have given people more liquidity of income, which they're now spending to some degree on Pizza Hut meals, which means that there's a greater demand for waiters in Pizza Hut. He can't, right? Nobody can trace that. So the
right. Nobody can trace that. Nobody can trace that. You know what else people can't trace? People can't trace the actions of a person who is malicious back to their genes or their race. Right? However, when we see patterns, we can see patterns in the world. We're empirical, and Stefan is an empiricist first and foremost. We can then form theories about those patterns, and then further look for evidence and refine them. So, we can't trace the actions of that person back to some government decision. Okay, fair enough. We also can't trace the actions of an individual to his collective. Does that mean that there is not an influence there? Does that mean that there is not dominoes that get set in motion? Not to say people are deterministic. The economy is not deterministic either. You can, get positives and negatives from any one thing. But the study of economics is a study of group behavior, and it's looking at things holistically, not on an individual. So, right. The seen and the unseen. We also have the white and the fellow white.
Truckers can see those driverless trucks taking my job. The guy who gets the job in the Pizza Hut, he can't make that. You can't follow those threads through. It's like if you spend a bunch of money to create a bunch of government jobs, the people who get those government job paychecks are like, yay, this is fantastic. And the other people who didn't get jobs, who didn't get raises, they can't look at that and say, oh, well, that's because of those government jobs, right? So if the truckers and the populace, like Tucker the trucker lover, I think that's kind of a tongue twister, I think. So if they get their way and the government is allowed in a truly fascistic way to ban, to destroy, to undercut and disallow a fledgling industry like driverless trucks, then the guy's going to be walking down the street. You know what he's going to see? Nothing. He's going to walk past the Pizza Hut. There's going to be nothing in the window, no sign that says, waiter wanted, waiters wanted. In fact, the sign may be going out of business.
It may be going out of business. True. Here again, Stefan is appealing to consequentialism. Now he would also say, well, it's not just about the consequences, it's about the morality, but he's also appealing to consequentialism. And to that I would just say, fine, we can appeal to consequentialism, but let's also look at some of the effects on the culture, the marriage rate, the demographics, which was Tucker's main point from the beginning. Tucker's not an economist, as you know, but he's just talking about hypothetically. If he was in government, that would be his instinct, would be to do that. Now, of course, he would talk with his advisors and stuff, so nothing's a done deal in politics. But the other thing here, let me skip ahead just a bit here. Thank you guys for sticking with me.
Profoundly disappointing. And this is all the stuff that Ben Shapiro should have been talking about. But again, when you get hit with that populist wave of sophistic passion, you have to really push back pretty hard.
Okay, so populist wave of sophistic fashion. That's a mouthful, but again, Tucker's not a populist. Okay, look at his debate with Cenk Uygur. He's not a populist because he supports whites. Okay, now he's not explicit about that, but I believe that implicitly he does, and even if he doesn't, he effectively is doing that. He's effectively defending us. So when whites become a minority, his positions will change. He will no longer be a populist because he'll still be defending whites. And that's really the difference between a populist and someone who is fighting on a racial basis.
Otherwise, you get washed over, or you look kind of like, well, I have these principles and they don't really apply to people, and yes, people should suffer for my principles. And it's like, no, the point is to reduce suffering as a whole. The point is to reduce suffering as a whole. There's a case to be made. It's abstract.
Suffering for who? Like, Of course, he's probably talking about human suffering, right? Because Stefan's not going to go out and say, well, we have to reduce the suffering of the ants, right? And so, because cars could drive over ants, we have to ban all cars, but ants are going to suffer. So that's not the calculation, right? And I just don't like approaching it from the suffering argument. That's something that Sam Harris does as well in his book, The Moral Landscape. He's always talking about how do we reduce suffering for the most number of people. And now, mind you, I don't think we should treat other races like animals, right? They are still humans, and we can negotiate, we can talk with them, of course. But we, reduce suffering for who? Because it's not going to be evenly distributed. Some people are going to get a net positive, and some people are going to get a net negative from a decision to let driverless cars go forward. I just want people to be aware of that.
Could very
But
much be real.
we're getting towards the end, and he's going to wrap up with his kind of closing argument here. So let's see if we can skip ahead just a bit. Let's try that.
Allows driverless trucks, but Canada doesn't. So you say, okay, well, we're going to put a tariff on Japanese products because they're using these driverless trucks. That's cheating. Right? Okay, well, it's so ridiculous. I mean, why do people think these things? All you have to do is say, well, what would you do if you were a Japanese executive, right? Other than work 18 hours a day and spend 3 hours a day extra doing karaoke before falling asleep on the subway and thus convincing your sons to grow up and never have children. But anyway, what would you do if you're a Japanese executive? Would you say, oh, well, they've put a tariff on the American imports because we have driverless trucks, so I guess we'll just give up on that entire market. Of course you won't. All you'll do is you'll open up a branch office in Canada and then just import your stuff from Canada. And then you end up playing whack-a-mole with all this stuff. The government has no incentive to really do it. All they want is the money. They don't care. I don't care about the business. They just want the money. So the idea that we just give government more and more power over the economy in order to somehow prevent a system that gives the government power over the economy, it really is tragic. It's like buying a male prostitute for your wife because you're afraid she might cheat on you or something. Get it over with. Let's get it over with. You don't defend.
I mean, he knows that immigration is going to increase the size of the government. He's done these studies, right? How many people have seen those Truth About episodes? Do you think that people are going to want to come to America more or less if there's all this, if there's driverless cars and therefore the economy is even better? We're kind of puttering along now, and so driverless cars would probably give us a boost, but like I said before, we've got all these other forces that are driving us down, and so I think that's why the establishment wants there to be driverless cars, because they're looking for the next revolution. They're looking to kind of see some, the internet really just bumped people up and preserved their manipulations and stuff, and we were able to continue the cultural and economic system of the system that discriminates against whites, that's anti-white. We were able to bump this up for a little bit longer, but now it's puttering again, and I think that's what they are hoping for, is that they'll be able to do this, and if it can disenfranchise some whites, all the better. So that's primarily why I'm skeptical, and I'm not someone who's an accelerationist. Please understand. I think that it's perfectly right to say, you can have this argument. Do we want a good economy or not? Now, I think if we were able to have strong borders and close down the borders and deport illegals, then it's a different situation. Then we can start to say, oh, well, maybe we can do some of these things that will help our economy because we don't have this giant pot of money waiting for people. I think we want to when it comes to the economy, we always want to go back to immigration and demographics. And maybe it makes me sound like a broken record, but that is what our enemies are primarily trying to do to win over. That's what the Democrats are trying to do. And I just think that if you're making these policy decisions and advocating for certain things without thinking of the political and demographic circumstances, you are dooming us. You are not helping, to use a Simpson quote from Little Ralph there.
And freedom, Tucker. You don't defend liberty by giving enormous central power, fascistic powers to the state. You're falling into a trap. It's a well-laid trap. It's pretty bloody obvious when you see it. And you have too big a platform to be that irresponsible regarding the realm of ideas. You have too big a platform to be that irresponsible regarding the realm of ideas. And yeah, Ben Shapiro, you should shape up those arguments, man. You got to be able to handle.
Right. So Tucker Carlson has too big an audience, and I do agree with that generally. The bigger your audience, the more responsibility you have to deliver something that's truthful. And I think, again, to sum up, I would have liked for Tucker to have had more nuance on these issues and to view this issue as really a negotiation, where he says, well, it's going to be bad for my people, because that's a way you can get around. You can be a little more explicit by just saying, oh, I want to help my people, and then people can wonder, oh, who are your people? Well, you don't actually have to say, I'm pro-white, or something like that. But yeah, he wants to make sure that his people are in the best situation possible, because that's all that we have left. Like, this thinking that if you win ideologically but you lose with your people, somehow you come out on ahead. It's like, first of all, even if we could have this kind of libertarian world with less government and have all this multiculturalism, even if Hispanics and Indians and Aboriginals and blacks, even if they primarily voted Republican and they wanted less government, which we know is not the case, even if that were true, what does that mean to just surrender your people? Are we not, although we are philosophers, are we not also biological organisms? And it is the mistake of the kind of philosopher in a tank who's theorizing about things abstractly to remove himself from the science of things. Likewise, I don't think that the scientists are completely right. I don't think that taking a nihilistic, strictly biological approach and what is good for myself as a replicating strand of DNA, I don't think that's the right way to go either. We have to accept these realities and walk this difficult balance. But ultimately, those who are not going to be tied down by their principles are the ones who will come out ahead on the evolutionary struggle. And I think that's kind of the trap. If there's anything that's a trap, it's people using your principles against you, and you're saying, well, you know, I can't do something that supports government in any context. Again, on this issue, I would probably, if I had to choose, I'd probably lean towards the free market side and say, okay, let's go forward with this. But again, I want to see what we can get out of it. Is there a way that we can negotiate this that will be a boon for the economy and help our people? Can we get some kind of trade with immigration? Just get people thinking about things, because the other side, like, there is some room for negotiation, and we can actually, I think we have more of a possibility to move people on this if we're open and we're not just thinking about things ideologically. He says you're falling into a trap, a well-laid trap. Well, Stefan, what are you going to do if the only choices left to you are fascism and communism? Are you going to just not ever pick a side? Are you willing to do that? Now, I hope that those are not the only two choices left to us. I talked in the previous episode with Tom Kaczynski. He thinks that communism is kind of like a 50% chance, and then fascism maybe like a 10% chance, and then there's the other 40, which is where there's room for some kind of I don't know, like some room to break apart or decentralize things and still retain our autonomy. You know, go listen to that episode. It's a good episode, but I just think that we cannot let ourselves be trapped because we have these principles, and so we can't ever advocate for anything that would go against them. Yes, always say that government is force. Always say that government is immoral. And when I'm sorry, I should have used the word state there. Always say that the state and statism is immoral. That's fine, because as long as you keep repeating that truth, over time, people will try to come back towards what is moral, right? People don't want to be immoral. They yearn for morality, and they yearn for spirituality too. And for various reasons, we've been depriving ourselves, and other people have made it easy to deprive ourselves of that. But as long as you're still speaking that general truth, what we do is actually open. It's actually open to debate, and it's open to reasonable people coming to a conclusion. What we can't do is try to reason with unreasonable people, and so we just have to be mature about things and have the self-knowledge to understand who we're dealing with when we make these decisions. It's not just something that comes about in a void. So, well, that is all for now. And let me know what you guys think. I really appreciate it. Again, the people who gave me constructive feedback, and I will take that into consideration going forward. So without any other complications, I should be seeing you guys on Friday. Take care. Have a good night.